Hello, everyone. My name is Carol Shim with KeepItSafe, and we thank you for attending today's webinar, New York Cybersecurity Regulation and Requirements. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your screen are multiple application widgets you can use. You can submit your questions through the Q&A widget, and we'll try to answer these during the webcast. But if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, it'll be answered later via email. Please know that we do capture all questions, and a copy of today's slide deck and on-demand webinar will be available to you, and you can use the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. In today's agenda, we will cover the background of the regulations and requirements, remedies for data protection, and the KeepItSafe solutions that can help with your compliance needs. So with that, please enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you, Carol, and hello, everybody. I want to start out by just talking a little bit about who the Department of Financial Services is, because that's an important thing to understand when you're looking at this regulation and how to comply with the regulation. What it really means is understanding who the regulator is and how they behave and how they think. Because we talk a lot about NYDFS without really thinking about who is behind NYDFS. So DFS is the result of a merger in 2011 between New York State's insurance and banking regulators. And so as a result, it has a fairly broad level of jurisdiction in New York. It covers everything from domestic and foreign bank branches to insurers to things you might not even think about. So payment processors, for instance, often come under its domain, as do pension plans and annuities. And so as a result, a lot of organizations that have no connection to the financial services industry actually come within its jurisdiction. For instance, universities that have annuity plans have licenses from the Department of Financial Services to operate those annuity plans. And when you think about banks, it's not just consumer retail banks, but it's also a lot of banking infrastructure behind them. So mortgage lenders, servicers, providers, investment banks, and those types of operations. What it does not cover is broker-dealers and investment advisors. So even though it's the Department of Financial Services, it's not actually covering the entirety of the financial services industry. On the insurance side, it covers everything you can think of from an insurance perspective. So insurers and reinsurers, both producers and servicers, underwriters, agents as well. So it has a fairly broad reach on the insurance side of the business. So it's a pretty big regulator, and because it's in New York State and because it covers foreign bank branches, it is also has a fairly global reach when it issues regulations, because it impacts organizations that are in the financial services industry and have a presence in New York, and which is largely every large financial institution in the world. So let's talk a little bit about how they regulate and how they behave with the regulations. So they're a small regulator. They're not very broadly staffed, but they, as I said, play a very big role from a global financial perspective, even though they're a state regulator here in the United States. Because of the scope of their jurisdiction, they play a much more outsized role globally. And the way that they manage that with the small staff that they have is by being very aggressive in targeted situations. They like to make an example of organizations that fail to comply with their regulations by issuing very, very large fines, by banning for periods of time organizations from operating in New York and making use of their licenses in New York. And so they're a very aggressive regulator in that sense. They will go after non-compliant organizations in a way that's intended to send a message to the rest of the industry that they need to comply with New York State's regulatory requirements. So when I drafted this slide, at the time that I drafted this slide, it was the case that New York State's Department of Financial Services had issued over $1 billion worth of fines to fewer than 10 institutions over the course of a year. It is now the case that New York State's Department of Financial Services has actually issued more than $1 billion worth of fines to just 3 institutions over the last 6 months. So to give you a sense of how aggressive they can be, they issued a $225 million fine for an alleged AML violation in May, a $350 million fine for alleged fraudulent conduct, and in January, $425 million fine for another AML compliance violation. So the expectation is that DFS will take a similar stance when it comes to its cybersecurity regulation, that if you fail to act in good faith compliance with the regulation, that you risk making yourself a target for one of these very large fines and regulatory actions. And when it comes to this particular regulation, DFS has made clear in one of their frequently asked questions, there's a frequently asked questions page for this regulation. One of the frequently asked questions is, can I certify compliance if I'm only partially compliant as of the date that I need to file that certification? And DFS has made clear that the answer to that question is no. If you are not completely compliant as of February 15th of next year with the requirements that were due on August 28th of this year, then you cannot certify. And the DFS starts the answer to that question with the Department of Financial Services expects complete compliance with this regulation. So they're taking this very, very seriously. So let's just talk very quickly about the history of the regulation, because I think that informs a little bit about how DFS views this regulation and how and the relationship between the development of the regulation and the industry itself. The regulation and the history of DFS with cybersecurity dates back to 2013. But I think and you can see on the screen here a complete history of how we got to the regulation that went into effect on March 1st. What I'd like to focus on is last year and the initial DFS Part 500 proposal that came out in the fall of last year, because it was different from the final version in a number of material respects. In particular, it was more prescriptive than the current regulation is. It required certain controls to be in place regardless of the organization's risk exposure and the type of organization. It was very much a one-size-fits-all type regulation. It also required the reporting of all cybersecurity events to DFS within 72 hours. And the reaction to that regulation was fairly swift and consistent, which is that the scope of DFS's jurisdiction is very broad, the organizations that it regulates vary tremendously, and one-size-fits-all simply cannot work. A number of the technologies that DFS has suggested must be in place in the original proposed regulation are technologies that would be very difficult for some of the smaller institutions and foreign bank branches to implement. Would be incredibly difficult for insurers who are not as advanced as some of the larger banking institutions to implement in the time period provided by the regulation. And because they were literally written into law, they were freezing in time the types of technology that organizations were to use to protect themselves. From a reporting perspective, the number of incidents that financial institutions in New York receive on a weekly basis, much less an annual basis, would have generated a flood of reports to DFS that would have overwhelmed DFS. And so DFS withdrew that proposal and then reissued a new proposal in February of this year that was markedly different and addressed a number of those concerns. In particular, it established a materiality threshold for reporting of cybersecurity events, but it also based a number of the controls and protection requirements in the regulation on a risk assessment. So it made it a risk-based approach, a lot more flexibility than the original approach. Yet at the same time is a detailed regulation, probably the most detailed out there yet, even more so than I think than the NAIC's new insurance model law proposal in a lot of respects, although the NAIC adds some detail to some areas of DFS's Part 500 regulation. So it is still very detailed, but it allows flexibility based on that risk assessment so that organizations can really focus their resources where they need to be focused and address the concerns that face that particular organization. Well, let's take a quick look at the requirements themselves. The requirements can be broadly broken into two groups. There are governance requirements, and then there are technical requirements. On the governance side, these requirements were largely required to be in place by August 28th of this year, and they include such things as having a cybersecurity program that reflects that risk-based approach I just discussed, having a policy suite that addresses 14 particular areas, and those policies have to be reviewed by the board, or have to be reviewed by the board of directors, but also have to be approved at least annually by a senior official. You have to have a dedicated chief information security officer. This is something that can be outsourced, but the management of that individual, if you outsource it, cannot be outsourced. There's still an oversight requirement in-house. There's a requirement for personnel who perform cybersecurity duties to have particular training and record that training so that it can be reviewed. Requirement for a third-party information security policy, limitations on data retention. So this is both sides of data retention. So you have to maintain, and you'll see this on the other side of the slide here in a minute, you have to maintain certain records for a period of time. In this case, it's cybersecurity-related records for 3 years, financial records sufficient to recreate financial transactions for 5 years. On the other side, you have to have in place a data disposal plan and policy so that you're not retaining sensitive information forever. There's a requirement, just like for cybersecurity personnel, there's a separate requirement for training and monitoring of staff, and so the monitoring part is important there. It's not simply enough to provide annual training. There has to be some sort of user behavior analytics or other type of user monitoring involved. You need to have an incident response plan, and you have to conduct the periodic risk assessments that are required in order to really formulate what the cybersecurity program looks like, where the appropriate controls belong, and where you need to spend your resources. On the other side of the spectrum are technical requirements, which include things like multi-factor authentication, encryption, the penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, the audit trail retention that I just mentioned. You have certain controls around access privileges. You're required to implement the principle of least privilege. There are application security development practices that are required to be in place to ensure that applications developed in-house are appropriately secure. And then I've included this on the technical side, though really it sits between the governance and the technical side because there is both a governance and technical element to it, which is that 72-hour breach notification to DFS, not only of incidents that affect the institution that are sufficiently material. In this case, it's a material event that affects a material part of the business operations. But also if you have an obligation to notify any other regulator or supervisory body, which has been broadly interpreted to include foreign bodies, so if those subject to GDPR have the same requirement when they have to report to their data protection authority, then you have to inform DFS of that as well. And the interesting aspect of that is the way DFS words that language, it ties nicely to the advisory that FinCEN sent out last year regarding what it calls cyber suspicious activity reports. So filing a suspicious activity report that involves some sort of cybersecurity activity that may have an impact on financial transactions, then you would also have to inform DFS. And so you're seeing this tying together of the fraud side of the house with the cybersecurity side of the house. And this is really, I think, the first codification of both between FinCEN and DFS of that convergence between the two. All of this is tied together by one principle, which is it's intended to protect what DFS calls non-public information. And non-public information includes the usual things like protected personal identifiable information, so PII, protected health information, and then a broader category of what I would call business critical information. This is information that if manipulated, compromised, stolen, would have a material impact on business operations or security. And so that category is something that each institution really needs to define for themselves, but is beyond the classic protected data of PII and PHI. So let's talk a little bit about when these requirements are due and how you get to these requirements. As I mentioned earlier, there was the August 28th deadline that just passed, where a lot of the governance requirements needed to be in place. These include everything from having a cybersecurity program and having a CISO to having those 14 points covered in your policy suite and having training and awareness for your information security personnel. The next deadline is on March 1st of next year. And on that deadline, and I apologize, on the left-hand side of the slide, it says February 28th, 2018. That's actually August 28th of 2017 are those requirements that needed to be in place. The March 1, 2018 requirements are the first of the technical requirements. So these are everything from having a report to the board of directors on the program, having your pen testing and vulnerability assessments, the first one's completed, completing that risk assessment that forms the basis of the program going forward. Multi-factor authentication needs to be completed at that point where based on that risk assessment it is expected to be. And then you need to have the training program in place for your overall personnel, your overall staff. The next deadline after that, I know it says August 31st. DFS has since clarified that it's actually September 3rd, is the remainder of the technical requirements. So this is everything from having the audit trail for material financial transactions and cybersecurity events in place, having the application security development program in place, having the data retention limitations in place, and then having the encryption and user monitoring in place. So these are the heavier lifts from a technical perspective, and that's why they're further out. The very last deadline is the third-party program, and that's due in March or February or March of 2019. And the reason why that is so far out is what DFS is requiring you to do is push down your cybersecurity requirements to your third parties. And that means that you need to have third parties that are prepared to do that. And we're starting to see a lot of the third-party service providers getting there with their expectations that they're going to have to comply or write off the financial services industry, which they really don't want to do. But obviously you can't comply with that third-party requirement until there are third parties that you can select from that would enable you to comply with it. So how do you get there? Well, the biggest thing you need to do is, and it's in the middle of this slide, but I'm going to pull it up to the top, which is understand what non-public information is. That's the scope of the regulation, right? So the PII and PHI is easy. What we're finding is a lot of people haven't given that same level of thought to what is that business critical information. Because however you define that portion of non-public information, that's really going to define the scope of impact on your organization of Part 500. And if you're an insurer, you can expect that you're going to see that same non-public information definition appear in the NAIC's model rule when it goes to a vote on December 4th of this year and ultimately gets implemented in each of the states. So you need to do that. Once you have that, you need to build a roadmap, which requires understanding where you are relative to the regulations requirements. So undertaking that gap assessment and really getting an understanding of what remediation do I need to do. Because what you'll find is the timeline is incredibly tight. It's a very, very difficult regulation to comply with from a timing perspective. And so unless you have a roadmap that really links together all of the dependencies, you're not going to be able to get there. Do not underestimate, I know a lot of people took a breather after August 28th. Do not underestimate the amount of time it will take to get to compliance. The transition periods exist not to give you a break and let you relax, but they exist because it will take at least that much time to get to implement the requirements of the regulation. And then finally, like I said, non-public information, you really do need to know what is it, where is it, right, which requires an understanding of your own data classification. And then from a design standpoint, how do you protect it, which requires having that risk assessment in place, understanding your risk tolerance, and figuring out how do you align your cybersecurity program to the regulations requirements without breaking that cybersecurity program by taking advantage of the pieces of the program that you already have in place today and making modifications to that to align to the regulations requirements without creating new policies and procedures unnecessarily, and therefore actually increasing your security vulnerability rather than decreasing it. So there are a couple of unstated requirements in the regulation. I know we've gone through a lot of requirements for this regulation, but there are a couple of unstated requirements for this regulation, things that you need to have in place in order to comply with it. You won't be able to meet the requirements of the regulation. And the big ones are data classification. As I mentioned, you need to know where your non-public information is. If you don't have some form of data classification in place, you may be able to figure out where your non-public information is today, but you won't know where it is tomorrow. You really need that data classification system in place in order to monitor where the data travels and put the appropriate protections over the right systems and applications and users. Otherwise, you're going to be constantly fighting a fire trying to keep your organization in compliance. The other advantage of having data classification in place is it's a great way to start in defining what is that business critical information, because you can use the high level sensitivity, the confidential or strictly confidential, highly confidential data classification levels as a basis, or at least a starting point, to define what is that business critical information. You need to have some form of endpoint protection and event monitoring. If you don't have that, you're not going to be able to do the audit trails. You're not going to be able to do the reporting on 72 hours, in 72 hours and the like. And then finally, access controls. Obviously, if you don't have an access control system in place, you're not going to be able to implement least privilege because you're not going to know who has access to what systems. And you're obviously also not going to be able to implement multi-factor authentication. And so you need to have an access control system in place. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over to Mark Steimer, who's going to go further into depth into the data protection and business continuity requirements of the regulation and how you can meet those requirements.
Thank you, Doug. Doug just covered for you New York cyber rules and regulations. I'm going to cover why your data protection or backup is not compliant with those rules and regulations. My name is Mark Steimer. I'm the Chief Dragon Slayer of Dragon Slayer Consulting. I've been doing this for more than 19 years, and I've been in the industry more than 37. I help vendors improve their marketing, but for end users, I help you solve your problems for free. If you have a problem, you have an issue, you're welcome to email me, call me, or tweet at me, and I promise I'll get back to you. If you want to check and see some of the things I've done, just Google my name, and you will find thousands of articles and white papers I've done over the years. On this agenda, we're going to cover a number of things. We're going to go over the timeline quickly. We're going to talk about the specific sections that deal with data protection and recovery, and why traditional data protection and backup is insufficient. And then I'm going to tell you what's required to be compliant. I like to tell stories when I go over presentations, and stories with a point. And this one is about a young man who believed he was dead. And his family was very worried because he was absolutely convinced he was dead. So they sent him to a psychiatrist. And the psychiatrist spent weeks, months trying to convince this young man he was not indeed dead. He wasn't getting anywhere, so he pulled out all these medical books, and he showed the young man that dead people don't bleed. And it took him a while, but he finally convinced the young man that dead people don't bleed. And he asked him, "Do you believe that?" And he says, "Yes, I believe dead people don't bleed." Suddenly, without warning, the psychiatrist whips out a pin and pokes the young man in the finger, and he starts to bleed. And he points to the blood, and he says, "What does this tell you?" And the young man looks at his finger and the blood dripping out of it, and he says, "Oh my God, dead people do bleed." Delusions are difficult to overcome. So the data protection and backup we've been using for years, we think, hey, it's worked in the past. It'll work fine for these new rules and regulations. It doesn't. If you look at the New York Cyber Rules and Regulations, Part 500 of Title 23, these are the organizations affected. If you're one of these organizations, you too have to be in compliance with those rules. Any of these organizations. And you do business in New York, you must be compliant. Now, here's the timeline. Now, a number of these deadlines have passed, but there are quite a few coming up, very major ones. One in February of next year, March of next year, and September of next year, and finally March of the following year. You have to be in compliance or you can face severe financial penalties. Now, on the data protection and recovery specific sections, the key thing to remember is when you have a cybersecurity event, you must be able to recover and restore normal operations and services promptly. That is the key thing to remember. In addition, you must have a business continuity and disaster recovery plan and the resources to implement that plan. And finally, you must be able, and again, this comes down to promptly respond to and recover from any cybersecurity event that materially affects the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of your information systems. Now, backups and data protection traditionally were the last line of cyber defense. They're traditionally utilized to recover from spray and pray, random cyber attacks, or phishing attacks. Now, in the spray and pray, that's the stuff where you get those things, click here and you can get a $50 gift certificate. Thank you, and click here and you get a $100 gift certificate. Phishing attacks are more along the lines of your bank has sent you this email saying your information's been compromised or you need to change it. Click here. That's a phishing attack. And some are spear phishing attacks where they're aiming at specific people in your organization. And user click mistakes typically are to malicious websites where they click on the wrong website that starts loading software onto your laptop, desktop, etc. So the traditional backup or data protection is your last line of cyber defense, and they use pretty well to recover from these kinds of attacks. But ransomware today has become the biggest aspect of malware. It's very big business. It's multi-billions of dollars of business. And large sums of that money being made is being poured back into R&D. And so there are more ransomware variations and more sophisticated variations than ever before. If you look at the time frame between August of 2014 and January 2017, just to put this in perspective, the number of malware attacks that were ransomware have grown by nearly 25%. That's huge. Ransomware, as I said, is getting more sophisticated. It doesn't just infect a machine and suddenly activate. No. What ransomware does, it infects that machine, but it doesn't activate. It seeks out every other machine that machine has access to. So it spreads. And every machine it infects, it spreads further till it can't spread any further. And then it may or may not activate immediately. It may wait a week. It may wait a month. It may wait 6 months. It's getting more sophisticated. Look at some of the ransomware stats by the numbers. In the last 12 months, there are 255 new ransomware families. New ransomware families. In the last, half a year, just a half a year from Q1 to Q3 of 2016, there were 1,100% more ransomware modifications. 6 in 10 malware payloads right now are ransomware. Individuals are attacked every 10 seconds and businesses every 40 seconds. And believe it or not, 20% of the businesses that paid the ransomware never got their data back. There's 4,300% more ransomware variants today in 1 year from Q1 of 16 to Q1 of 17 than there were. Attacks are actively bypassing security. They're getting past the front door. 70% of the time, they're getting past the front door. That means traditional security is not keeping up. And global ransomware damages are estimated for this year, right now, at more than $5 billion for businesses. That's not the total ransomware industry. You add in consumers, it's multiple billions of dollars. And 72% of the hit businesses lost data access for 2 or more days. 33%, 5 or more days. And 71% of businesses targeted were actually infected. And 21% of financial institutions have been dealing with ransomware. These are mind-boggling numbers. If you look at the growth in ransomware strains since December of 2015, you can see it's on an exponential curve. And ransomware, as I said, is evolving. It's evolving to most backups and data protection. There are two variants you need to be concerned with. One is deletes and encrypts backups, and the other is attack loop. Let's talk about the one that deletes and encrypts backups. It's called SAMIS. It will actually go out and seek the files that are the backups and delete them before it activates. It's already done this on Veeam, on Commvault, on NetBackup from Veritas, and Backup Exec from Veritas. And it keeps expanding the number of backup applications that it deletes these backups. So you don't even know you're in trouble till you're encrypted. You got to back it up, take the backup, recover from it, and no backups. This is a problem. Attack loop is a little bit more sophisticated than that. Attack loop is basically you get infected, and then it spreads, but it doesn't activate immediately. So when it does activate, you go to do a recovery. You do a recovery from typically the most recent backup. And when you do that recovery, you get infected again because the backups are already infected. So you go back a week. You lose a week of data. It too is infected. You go back a month. It too is infected. You go back 3 months. It too is infected. How much data can you afford to lose? This is the attack loop because it's not just infecting your primary data, it's infected your backups as well. To be compliant for the New York Cyber Rules and Regulations, you must block that hidden ransomware in either the backup or recovery stream. That means you can stop the attack in its tracks before you recover it so you can do a safe recovery. That's what it means to be compliant. Other keys to the New York Cyber Rules and Regulations data protection compliance: you got to eliminate attack vectors. Make sure backups can't be seen by the ransomware. If it can't be seen, it can't be deleted or encrypted. So you can put them out of reach or you can mask it. Change the naming convention. Better to stop the encryptions or deletions require multi-factor or two-factor authentication. So if it goes to delete a backup file, it has to be authorized a second time. Well, any malware is not going to be sitting on your phone as well as your machine in which you're doing the backups. So it's going to sit there and go, I want to delete this, and it won't be able to because it can't enter the authentication number. So in summary, New York Cyber Rules and Regulations, Part 500 of Title 23, and I know that's a mouthful, requires that you have rapid recovery and restore from cybersecurity events, and that you have an effective business continuity and DR plan. Traditional data protection and backups are not that plan. They're not going to allow you to do that because it doesn't protect you against ransomware that encrypts or deletes the backups and makes them unrecoverable, or attack loops where the backup is already infected with the malware. You have to resolve this by masking or placing backups out of reach from the ransomware, or two-factor authentication to prevent deletions and encryptions, and scrubbing of the malware from the backups. That's what's required. So I'm going to finish on another scene. These three friends decided to go fishing one day. It was a beautiful fall day, and the mist is rising off the lake. And the three friends, one is a Catholic, one's a Protestant, the other's an agnostic. And about an hour into their fishing, the Catholic stands up and he says, guys, I lost my lure. I'm going to go get another one. He jumps out of the boat, runs across the water, gets his lure, runs back across the water, and gets back into the boat. Now, the agnostic sees this, and he starts scratching his head. He goes, I must have had too much to drink last night. I didn't really see this. Couldn't have happened. So a couple hours go by, and the Protestant stands up. He goes, gents, I'm out of bait. I'm going to go get some more. Jumps out of the boat, runs across the water, gets all the bait he can carry, runs back across the water, and gets back into the boat. Now, the agnostic, having seen this, says, well, if they can do it, I can do it. He stands up and he goes, guys, I'm going to go on a coffee run. Jumps out of the water, splash, flailing around. His buddies reach over to the side of the boat and try to pull him in. And the Catholic turns to the Protestant and he says, do you think we should have told him where the rocks are? Now J2 will show you where the rocks are.
Thank you, Mark, and hello, everyone. My name is Patrick Rougeau, and I'm a solutions engineer at KeepItSafe. I help our customers pick out different backup and disaster recovery products to meet the recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives. And specifically, a lot of the talks that I've been doing and conversations I've been having are around this new financial compliance. And for the past decade, we've been helping financial firms back up their data and, most importantly, be able to answer to auditors and compliance officers about why they're using KeepItSafe. But we'll first start off with some due diligence about our data centers and our background to get everybody familiar with our brand. All right, so let's start off with some key points about KeepItSafe. KeepItSafe is actually owned by a company called J2 Global, and they've been in the cloud services industry for over 20 years, and we're a $1.2 billion company. So from a business size standpoint and financially stable standpoint, we're a great partner. We also have more than 50 petabytes of data under management across all of our backup products. And what kind of makes us unique is that we develop our own backup software, but we also resell other leading products. So we have support, engineers, network operations that vault and support and kind of work with you to deploy our different products and make sure they work through their entire life cycle within your organization. And from a security standpoint, which we'll get to more specifics in a later slide, all of your data is encrypted at rest and in flight. And there's some specific kind of feature sets that the financial industry likes, that auditors like to see, and then, hey, you're doing your due diligence about who to partner with, so you want to make sure you have all that information. So my client focus is the US and Canada, but it's great to know that if you're looking for a partner that will grow with you or make sure that we have data centers all over the place just in case you merge with another company, you acquire another company, or if you already have offices in other countries. What's great is this gives us engineers, network operations, support people from all over the world with different perspectives and client bases. So we're going to help you comply with, U.S.-based and Canadian-based regulation, but anything that you need to send overseas, or if you're looking to actually vault your data in a different country, we can help you with that. You can start off by sending data to maybe another country first, or start off vaulting in the U.S. and then move to data centers in other places. Our next area of interest here are some benefits of working with KeepItSafe. I wanted to preface that we'll work with you as much as you want us to. Sometimes we're behind the curtain where we just train our end users and then they kind of hit the ground running, or we're involved in absolutely everything. Creating the backup sets, helping figure out retention periods, doing restores, reviewing the bill and kind of like a storage review month to month. But we're here to help you design and configure everything if you want that. We have 24/7 emergency support. We're always proactively monitoring the vaults on your behalf, and we can provide daily reporting and monitoring to your IT staff or to you directly. And when you're talking about encryption, we use AES 256-bit at rest and in flight. And the retention periods are not limited to months or years. You can keep every single end of day for long periods of time, or you can do shorter retention periods. We don't limit how often you back up and how long you keep data for. And when there's an emergency where we have to maybe ship you an external hard drive or a NAS device with your data on it, that happens at no charge. We're working with physical servers, virtualized servers, storage devices, and there's a lot of really cool support APIs for those products. And when it comes to disaster recovery, we can help you with backup plans, failover plans, and make sure that you're prepared for our crisis, because all of our engineers are able to support every product in multiple locations around the world. Yes, the 3-2-1 rule. Now, I've seen variations of this rule, and it's not something that's written in stone, but this is what solutions engineers or backup engineers like to talk about when it comes to diversifying where your data is kept. We want to make sure that you're geographically diverse when you're keeping that one copy in the cloud or multiple copies in the cloud. But we can help you achieve this either in a private cloud scenario or a hybrid cloud scenario. We understand that not every business is looking to use a third-party cloud, but obviously that helps you scale, that helps you move a little bit quicker and be nimble when you have to maybe add a lot of data or add a different type of technology. So with 321, it's not specific to a particular backup platform. What I've seen as well is keeping one copy locally and then multiple copies in the cloud, like going to like a primary and secondary data center. So this industry is growing, and that's good for us, but it's also good for you as well. When you have more businesses using cloud backup and using long-term retention and archiving with a third party like KeepItSafe, it gets everyone more comfortable with the cloud. We have certifications, we have encryption, we have other verticals like healthcare and government in our vaults, and it gets the executive level down to the IT department comfortable leveraging hybrid cloud solutions. And really, more so, it's going to help you sleep better at night, but also you won't have to worry as much when it comes to scaling and then different kinds of turns that doing everything yourself would actually be almost detrimental or impossible to accomplish. If you grow by 2x, by 5x when it comes to storage, for whatever reason that may be, you want to have a partner that's going to bring you through that process and say, hey, we have plenty of resources to accommodate what you're trying to achieve. So I was an IT director and an IT consultant, and disaster recovery as a service was something that has really caught on in the past few years. But before that, you had to stay up for 24 hours or 72 hours just to rebuild a server or rebuild an environment, and it was really stressful. And disaster recovery as a service just lets us kind of perform one-click recovery of an entire system or application group in our data center, in a remote data center, in one of the colos. So from cloud backup growing and cloud usage just being more adopted across the board and across verticals, we're seeing disaster recovery as a service a really huge push for organizations last year and even more so next year to move to disaster recovery as a service versus trying to do everything themselves and then just paying for their usage in the data center when they have a drill or have an actual crisis. So this is why, as a solutions guy within KeepItSafe, my job is actually fairly simple. So we have a lot of different product categories. We have our online backup product category, and that's really about keeping data for long periods of time or just moving mission-critical data to a geographically diverse location. And then our next product category is disaster recovery, and that's more about hitting aggressive recovery time objectives, trying to recover a server or system within a short period of time. And then we have our mobile backup category, and that's really focused around endpoint backup, but also encryption, geolocation, remote wipe, secure file sharing, those things that you would need for maybe an auditor if someone lost a laptop or a tablet. You need to be able to prove that you can wipe the device with NSA standards and make sure that you've protected the data on that particular device. And then our last backup category is actually kind of an emerging category for us, and it's KeepItSafe cloud-to-cloud backup. So this is data that resides in Office 365, Salesforce.com, or Google Docs. And for compliance reasons, you may not be keeping data for long enough with those clouds. So we can actually extract it and then vault it with KeepItSafe so you can keep data for longer periods of time, or if you stop paying your bill or lose control over your data because of maybe a malicious attack in your Office 365 environment, or someone kind of going rogue and deleting a bunch of data there, you have that outside of the Microsoft cloud environment and with KeepItSafe, just in case. So we touched upon security, but I wanted to be specific about what certifications we have. All our data centers are Tier 4 data centers, and we have, as an organization at KeepItSafe, an ISO cert as well as individual certs for those data centers. So SSAE 16 certified, also PCI compliance. Like I said in earlier slides, your data is always encrypted at rest and in flight and stays in country. And then from a due diligence standpoint, we fill out due diligence questionnaires for our customers because there's a lot of times where it's once a year or every few years there's a kind of tailored due diligence questionnaire that we need to work with you on. So there's some organizational specific questions you may have, but then we have these kind of industry standard certs so you can feel comfortable and know that we're safeguarding your information. KeepItSafe has a lot of compliance experience. So for the past decade, financial firms have been coming to us for the SEC compliance 17A-4. And one of the really important details about just compliance in general when you need to keep data for long periods of time is what am I capable of doing with your service, and how long have you been backing up other financial firms' data? And what we're trying to do is make sure that we translate our experience over this the past 8, 9, 10 years working with financial firms and translate that a little bit to this new regulation that we've been talking about today. So from a high level, we're going to talk about the details and how that kind of carries over so you can see a comparison. But what we do for 17A-4 is keep every single end-of-day version for files and databases for 7 years for hedge funds, broker-dealers, investment banks. And what's really important about that is our software is FIPS 140-2 compliance. And that's just a cryptography standard that any healthcare, financial, or government organization should be looking for when they're picking backup software or software in general. For 17A-4, there was a worm media requirement where when you backed up to tape or external hard drive, you would vault that. And what we would do is we'd replace tape and external hard drives in using a vaulting company, and we would turn on what's called delete lock. So the really important thing about delete lock is that your retention rules don't get overwritten, right? So if someone has a 7-year retention period and they decide to turn that into a 3-year or 30-day retention period, there needs to be a smart enough mechanism to stop that from happening. Same thing if an administrator or someone that has access to the backup software needs to come in and actually maybe do some work but inadvertently deletes data in the backup software. Delete lock and worm media requirements of write once, read many will give you the ability to safeguard your data and even protect you from yourself, or if someone that doesn't know what they're doing or has some type of malicious intent can't remove the data from the KeepItSafe vaults. And so that's really important. When you have we'll just say, some type of attack, ransomware attack, or a breach where someone gains access, you don't want them to be able to clear out all of your vaults, and then you lose everything, and you can't prove that you've been backing up and complying with the law this entire time. So another component is index search. Being able to search for a file name across 7, 10 years of backup is really important and will save you time when you're getting audited, right? So that's a big deal when you're trying to verify different file names across years of backup. And you want to know exactly the UNC path or the path that you find that particular file in production. How do you get there? Where is it? Also, audit trails are something that not a lot of backup vendors think about. And who's changing the software? When you go into a backup set and you accidentally change a password or screw something up so backup stops occurring, maybe you go in and change the schedule or something like that. You want to be able to go back as an administrator or as an auditor and say, did anybody do anything accidentally or malicious inside the software? Encryption, I think we've talked about enough, but the letter of compliance, the next thing on this list, is what we've been doing for financial firms for SEC compliance is basically building a letter that says, we're KeepItSafe, this is what we're doing for this financial organization. So they can present that to an auditor first, right? There's a lot of other services out there, aside from backup, that will give you some type of document to show that you're complying with the law. And we're translating that over to this new regulation. And the designated third party isn't a requirement by the new regulation. But if you do want a designated third party where we have access to the data, we have access to the encryption keys, you can do that. To say if someone leaves the organization or if for some reason you can't give an auditor access to the data, you can give that responsibility to us. So the designated third party isn't part of this particular regulation, but that's an option for you when you're deploying our software. So my last point before I conclude, I want to talk a little bit about ransomware. I've done probably 5 webinars in the past 2 months about ransomware because it's so prevalent in the news and a lot of our customers are asking about it. We know that backup is the last line of defense against ransomware, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the attack loop. And that's really when you back up the ransomware, right? And then you maybe restore it again inadvertently because you didn't realize that it spread across the network, that that was the particular file that was infecting your network. Or the other scenario is when you go to do a restore and you restore the data from 2-3 months ago, maybe for a user or for a test maybe that you're running on your network, and then you reintroduce that ransomware attack into the environment. And a couple things that we're doing for ransomware is we're trying to prevent that attack loop by scanning data that's being backed up for ransomware and also scanning it before it gets restored. And if it's caught in the backup or the restore, that data gets quarantined. Another really cool feature that we're enabling for our customers that care about ransomware is if you have virtual machines, is monitoring those machines with the backup software and creating kind of a resource profile. So if it's using a lot of resources on the network or using a lot of resources with RAM or CPU, we can say, hey, this looks like suspicious activity and has the characteristics of a ransomware attack. So there's a few different ways that KeepItSafe is uniquely positioned to help financial firms with ransomware today and also in the future. Because the statement I'm hearing is not, if we get hit with ransomware, but it's really about when. Thank you so much for taking the time to participate in today's webinar. You stick around, we're going to move to Q&A.
Thank you, Patrick, Mark, and Doug for this very informative presentation. Our first question is a 2-part question for Doug. What kinds of financial penalties are there for non-compliance? And if non-compliant, is there an appeals process, and how does that actually work?
Sure. So for financial penalties, I'm not aware of any actually being issued to date, although to be fair, the first compliance deadline was August 28th of this year, so there hasn't been a tremendous amount of time for that to occur. But I will say DFS is a very aggressive regulator. They do publish their fines. You can see them online. And I think what you'll find is that they have issued well over $1 billion worth of fines to only a handful of institutions over the course of the past year. They seem to understand the size and resources that they have, and yet the size of the industry that they regulate, and so they like to make an example when they do issue a fine to deter other similar activity, and so the fines tend to be incredibly large, depending on the type of institution, obviously. For non-compliance generally. For DFS non-compliance, we haven't actually seen any actions that I'm aware of, and so I can't speak specifically to that, but that's generally how DFS behaves. In terms of an appeal process, the entire process operates under the administrative procedure laws of New York State. So the initial complaint and hearing all take place in an administrative proceeding in front of the superintendent or her designee, and a finding is made at that point. Oftentimes these are resolved with consent orders or agreements between the banks or other financial institutions and DFS. But if they do go to a hearing, it's a hearing under the administrative procedure law, so it's an administrative type proceeding without the formalities of a trial. There is an appeal process from that under Article 78 of New York State's Civil Procedure Law, and called the CPLR. And that proceeding, what that allows is an appeal to the trial level court, called in New York State the Supreme Court, at which point you enter into the standard formal legal process. A hearing is held, the evidence is evaluated, and the decision is made, and then you have appeal rights to the Appellate Division of New York State and ultimately to the Court of Appeals of New York State, which is the highest level court in New York State. So there is an appeals process that goes through the formal judicial channel. It rarely ever gets there. more often than not, the matters are resolved prior to a hearing within the Department of Financial Services.
Great. Thank you, Doug. Our next question is for Patrick. What type of service support do you provide during a recovery?
Yeah, so there's a couple different points there. The first thing is that we have 24/7 support, and we understand that in audits, when you have to kind of leverage all our backup features to prove to an auditor that you're doing the right thing is not something you're going to do every single day. So we actually work with our customers directly when they're getting audited to make sure that we can show audit trails, the index search feature I talked about, how to reproduce files for an auditor. And then there's also the business continuity and disaster recovery piece, and that's proving either from a kind of disaster recovery drill report that you're able to recover entire systems or large application groups either locally or in our cloud. So it really comes down to the full disaster recovery piece that you may have to prove to an auditor, but then also reproducing and searching for files that are in question during a review.
Great. And does KeepItSafe also help against ransomware?
Yeah, I think the differentiation for ransomware is, we don't sell antivirus, right? So we're not installing antivirus on endpoints or servers or doing gateway antivirus at the firewall level. What we do is we try to make sure that the backup data is clean, and that's really scanning the data before it's backed up and quarantining it and before it's restored. So you can always review that quarantine on a daily basis or weekly basis when you get notified about something being caught there. The profile monitoring is really about resources. So looking at machines, and if they're talking a lot on the network, saying more so, hey, this looks like a ransomware attack, like I mentioned before.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. This concludes our webinar, New York Cybersecurity Regulation and Requirements. Thank you so much for joining us today.